When we talk about trauma, what we're really talking about fundamentally is fear, because fear is at the core of trauma, of traumatic symptoms. Fear is at the core of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is how we have sort of formally encapsulated trauma, at least in the diagnostic world. And so it's really important to understand what fear is and how the brain processes fear. How does, when something terrifying happens, what happens to a person's brain? And we've actually been studying this, or the field of neuroscience, what we now call neuroscience. This has been a subject of intense study for years, decades. But it's also been a dramatically accelerating field of study, and largely because of tremendous advances in technology. So just as we're all aware that we walk around with iPhones and iPads now and things, and we can do amazing things that we couldn't even imagine 5 or 10 years ago, or certainly if you're as old as I am, 20 years ago. By the same token, medical science and the tools of neuroscience have also changed dramatically and evolved dramatically, so that we are now able to image the brain, for example, with technology that is increasingly refined. So, and this gives us the ability to see what the brain is doing, what the different brain regions are doing when a person is experiencing different things, for example, fear. Or when we're talking about trauma, of course, we're really talking about terror. So the foundation of the neurobiology of trauma is really the neurobiology of fear. And what we know is that when a human being experiences an intensely threatening, terrifying event, that there are really dramatic changes to the brain and how the brain functions. So one of the most fundamental things is that much of what we think of as sort of core human capacities, the ability to think, to reason, to plan ahead, to control our impulses and contain our emotions. So something might make you angry, but you don't automatically just yell out, obscenities or scream at the person. You have the ability to sort of think, well, that makes me angry, but and you have that brain working in there that helps you control yourself, helps you contain things, and also that's the part of your brain that enables you to reason through things, and well, all of that is really the frontal lobes. It's the part of your brain that's sort of right behind your forehead, and the frontal lobes are the most the last part of the brain to develop. Everybody who's got an adolescent, especially if you're going through it now, one of the reasons that adolescence is so trying on parents is that adolescents do not have full frontal lobe development. It's something that only fully develops in females somewhere around the age of 21, and males somewhere around the age of 25 or 26. And so it's the last part of the brain to fully mature. And it is a part of the brain is actually quite sensitive and delicate. And so what we now know is that when a human being experiences something terrifying, and actually when a human being actually experiences something even just stressful, that stress has a fairly significant impact on the ability of the frontal lobes to do their job. Certainly the amygdala, which is the part of the brain really from which fear sort of cascades outward. So when you experience something that either frightens you or terrifies you, the amygdala starts firing, and there are networks that branch out from the amygdala to various other parts of the brain. And one of the areas that the amygdala branches into is sort of back in the brainstem, and there are cells there that secrete norepinephrine and dopamine. And those are two neurotransmitters, and when they start flooding into the brain, they have a dramatic impact on the frontal lobes. And what they do is they really handicap the frontal lobes. And your frontal lobes essentially start, I don't want to say they stop functioning, but their ability to do all those things, those magical things that I was just talking about, degrades very, very quickly. And we can all experience this. If, I'm sure this sounds all very, kind of complicated, but if you just think about what happens if you're having a very, very, very stressful day at work, or you have to go into an exam, and on your way into the exam, something very stressful happens. All right, so you've been studying for weeks and weeks, and somebody says, "Hey, I just found out that they're not going to even test us on what we studied." And this is the exam that's going to determine whether or not you get into medical school or law school or something like that. And you are all of a sudden just flooded with anxiety and stress. And if in that moment you had to remember complex things or start, remember the things you studied, you'd find yourself, you getting more panicky, of course, because you'd find yourself thinking, well, I can't, my brain isn't working, right? I'm freezing. And what that is that's the frontal lobes really sort of in the process of shutting down, or at least being degraded. Now, so that's one aspect of how the brain responds to severe stress and fear. The other fundamental thing that happens is when the amygdala responds to a life-threatening stimulus and reacts, and norepinephrine and dopamine sort of are secreted into various neural circuits in the brain, it fundamentally alters how the brain processes what's going on. So we no longer encode experience in the same way. What the frontal lobes enable us to do with experience is it's not just the frontal lobes and the hippocampus, which is an integral part of memory functions. When they're functioning normally, they enable us to encode an experience in context, in sequence. And really, this is how most people think of memory. If you ask somebody, do you remember? Let's say you use an important, do you remember the day you got married? Do you remember the day you graduated from college? Or do you remember the day that, some important event, not a stressful event, not a traumatic event, just an important event. And they'll be able to remember things, details, and if you were to follow up with questions, says, well, all right, so it was something important, let's go back to the beginning of the day. All right, so what happened first? Where did you sleep that night? Where did you wake up? What did you do first? And people will be able to remember those details and remember them in sequence and remember them in context. And those are memories that are forged when the brain is functioning essentially normally. And again, it's because the frontal lobes are fully functioning and the hippocampus is fully functioning. When the brain is subjected to those stress hormones, when the amygdala is firing, when the person's experiencing something traumatizing, rather than remembering or encoding experience in that way, experience is encoded as intense fragments, and almost always they're sensory fragments. So you remember sights, you remember sounds, you remember smells. And you remember them so intensely, in fact, they are encoded so intensely that these are, of course, the kernels of what we will call flashbacks and nightmares. So you will wake up, if you have you're in a car accident, for example, a serious car accident, you may well wake up that night because all of a sudden you hear the sound of breaking glass. Or you may find yourself, you're sitting, and you take the cup of coffee up in the morning to drink, and all of a sudden you have the intense smell of gasoline. And those are classic, of course, intrusive post-traumatic experiences. And what they are, those are the kernels of how the trauma has been encoded by the brain as these intense sensory fragments. And because the frontal lobes and the hippocampus and the thalamus and their functioning has been so degraded by those stress hormones, certainly in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, will have a great deal of trouble remembering the experience as some kind of sequential, fully contextualized event. And what you'll have is this whole scramble or jumble of very intense fragments, and you may really not be able to remember things in sequence or know what happened. So if somebody were to ask you, let's see, we'll go back to that car accident. If somebody were to ask you, okay, so, all right, so you heard the breaking glass, you heard a scream in the car, you smelt the gasoline. Now I need to know what happened first. So was it the screeching tires? Was it the screams? Was it the breaking glass? And you'll think, and of course what you'll do, what most people do, is you'll try to reason it through. You say, well, let's say screeching tires first, all right, and then the breaking glass, and then somebody screamed. And do you really remember it that way? Well, maybe. Some people do. But it's also quite possible that that's simply taking those fragments and putting them into what seems like the most likely order. And of course that has a lot of implications for how we interact with victims of trauma, and the kinds of questions we ask of them and what we ask them to do in the wake of trauma, whether we are therapists, advocates, or whether we're law enforcement officers doing interviews with victims. These have tremendous implications for how we conduct those kinds of interviews and how we talk with victims. In the context of a law enforcement interview, when you are interviewing somebody who is a witness or a participant, or oftentimes they're both, in some kind of event, and you're trying to get information about what happened, if a person was traumatized, it's understandable that as a law enforcement officer, you're trying to get certain kinds of information that are directly relevant to your job. What part of what you're trying to do is figure out what happened here, and a big part of that would be what happened first, what happened after that, what came after that, and so forth. So it's natural to ask those kinds of questions of somebody who was there, who's a participant or a witness of this event. The problem is, if you think about the neurobiology that I've just been talking about how the brain encodes the experience, when you ask somebody who's been traumatized, whose brain has encoded the experience as these fragments, sensory fragments like this, they have very accurate information they can give you if you ask them questions about those sensory fragments. But the moment you start asking them questions that have to do with context and sequence, so again, was it the breaking glass or the screeching tires that happened first, or the scream? Well, in a particular car accident or investigation, those might be really important questions that ultimately need to be determined. But this may not be the right person to ask them. And if you do ask them, you run the risk of getting information from a witness or a victim that may be inaccurate. And in the context of a sexual assault investigation, there are additional potential downsides to that. So if you ask a sexual assault survivor questions that go beyond that basic sensory experience that she can report, and start asking her or him questions about sequence, about what time it is, or things that peripheral details that they may not have attended to, very often they'll try to answer those questions, and they'll try to answer them because they want to be good witnesses. They want to they know you're trying to do your job, and they're trying to help you. They're trying to answer your questions. And so they'll try their best to answer them. But if they get it wrong, or they don't really remember what happened first and second and third, so they tell you what they think at that moment, well then what happens when a day or two later, when they're asked the same sets of questions by another investigator, or by the same investigator, or by the assistant district attorney who's asking them questions, and now they don't remember it quite the same way because they never really remembered that sequence. And so now they answer it in a slightly different way. And now, of course, everything's being recorded in some way, right? So now you've got a statement from time one that has some information or detail here in one way, and then in time two, the same information is a slightly different order. Well, when the defense attorney looks at those statements, that's what's they're going to be called an inconsistency, right? And I've seen defense attorneys spend, an hour on one little inconsistency like this, and of course generalize from this that, well, clearly this person's lying. They're making this up. Because we know that's what happens, right? If somebody's lying, they don't quite remember it the same way. They can't keep track of what they said the first time. So in the second time, they say something a little different. Bingo, we've caught them. All right. When actually all we've done is we did an interview that was inappropriate for somebody whose brain had just encoded a trauma. And all we've done is actually we have demonstrated that this is precisely what happens when you ask trauma victims questions like this. So this becomes important. It's important for investigators, whether they are law enforcement, whether they're district attorneys from the DA's office, to understand the dynamics of trauma and even the biology of trauma, to understand what trauma victims can report accurately and effectively and what they can't. And to ask the kinds of questions that allow you to get solid information that you can rely on, and that do not create these kinds of artificial problems in an investigation. In general, somebody who is multiply victimized, so somebody who was sexually abused as a child and who has now been sexually assaulted, whether it's adolescent or young adult, there's a strong likelihood that how their brain has encoded this new experience is going to make it even more difficult for them to provide sort of details about what happened, especially again details in response to questions that are asking them to remember this in a way that their brain did not encode it. So the likelihood is that they will have the processes that I was talking about earlier, that of the brain encoding these very fragmented pieces of sensory information, that's going to be even more accentuated in them. And the reason for that is because, and we see this over and over again, when you interview or evaluate, when I've evaluated trauma survivors, sexual assault survivors who have been multiply victimized, almost invariably at some point, oftentimes very early in the assault process, so even before there was an assault, when the assailant, when the predator was even in the process of grooming them or beginning that phase of intimidation, in other words, when this victim started to get scared. What happens is it's not just that they're scared, is that it starts to trigger all the memories, the prior traumatic experiences. So their brain simply goes much more quickly into this mode of this terror mode. The frontal lobes start to degrade and they're functioning much earlier. The amygdala is firing like crazy. The brain is flooded with norepinephrine and dopamine. So their experience is actually quite different. In that case, it becomes really critical to conduct this interview in a way that fits how their brain encoded and processed the event. And I'd like to give an example that I think really sort of demonstrates this. And there was one of the evaluations I did a number of years ago. It was a very long evaluation. That's one of the things that is almost invariable in this kind of a circumstance, because it's very, very difficult for people to respond to the kinds of questions you need to ask. And during the course of the evaluation, I noticed that this woman was gripping her wrists with her other hand like this, one after the other. And I noticed it, and I also noticed that she was completely unaware that she was doing it. And so at a certain point, I stopped and I just looked at her wrist, and I put my hand in my wrist, and I said to her, I notice you've been doing this for quite a while now, and I'm just wondering if you could tell me what you feel when you do this. And the woman put her hand on her wrist like this and started weeping. And what happened is, for the first time, she was aware that she was there. She hadn't been aware of this. And then what she said is that for weeks that she'd been feeling like this, having these sensations that something or somebody was gripping her wrists. And that's why she kept doing this with her own hands, because it's a very strange sensation to feel like somebody's gripping your wrist, but there's no hand there. So she would put her hand there. Now, this was actually crucial forensic information, because what do you think she was experiencing here? What we ultimately were able to figure out was, of course, this was the rapist's hands pinning down her arms by gripping her wrists like this. She had no memory of the rapist doing that, because that's the kind of memory that the frontal lobes and the hippocampus produce, is a memory of an event like this. All she had was literally the physical sensation on her wrists, but just one fragment. So how was she going to have any access to that? She had no conscious access to it. All she was doing was physically doing this over and over again. Now, when you point that out, and she literally did it in front of me, put her hands on her wrists. Then she remembers this sensation. But even at that point, she remembered the sensation, but she couldn't say, oh, so that must have been the rapist who did this to me. She had no idea. But she could report the sensation. So that's what I mean by you gather that raw material as an investigator. You add it to all the other raw material that you get from the survivor, and you start piecing it together. There is some evidence that allowing somebody who's been through a traumatic experience to go through a sleep cycle increases their capacity to remember certain facets of the experience. And that is becoming more the norm now. For example, when a law enforcement officer has been involved in some kind of shooting, and there's an automatic investigation, there's now more and more departments, the policy is to allow them to go through a sleep cycle before they are interviewed intensively about what happened. So that there's that sort of. But I think more fundamental and more important than the timing of the interview is how the interview is conducted. That if you understand how the brain is affected by traumatic experience, and if you understand that it is encoded the experience in these fragments, then you conduct the interview that way. And so rather than asking questions like, okay, I want you to tell me what happened, and I want you to start at the beginning. Recognizing that that's not how this person will have encoded the experience, you ask sensory-based questions. And so you ask, tell me everything that you can remember about what you smelled. And don't even worry about, she may remember something that happened after the rapist left first. Fine, take that down. Do you remember anything else that you smelled? Because what might happen from this? Well, she may remember a particular smell of whether it's a cologne, a deodorant, and you know what? She may remember it so vividly that you could actually identify the brand of deodorant that guy was wearing. That might have to actually end up being crucial forensic evidence. And you'll only get that by just methodically asking her question after question about these kinds of sensory fragments and going from there are 5 senses. Go from one to another to another. And so and that's why that example that I gave earlier of the victim who was holding her hands, that was a sense. That was a sensory memory. It was a touch memory, right? And those kinds of memories, of course, are crucial in a rape investigation. have you had any other sensations on your body? Are there any other parts of your body where you feel pain? Are there any other parts of your body where you feel pressure? Are there any questions like that? That's how the experience was encoded. If you ask those kinds of questions, you'll start to get their experience, their actual memories of the event, which will actually start to fill in crucial pieces, forensic pieces of this puzzle of what happened to this person. The issue of false allegations is it's a very controversial issue. There's a tremendous amount of sort of heat around this, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there's good reason for there to be concern about this, because being falsely accused of something is a terrible experience, and to be falsely accused of a sexual crime, it can be a catastrophic experience. So it's understandable that people have a great deal of concern about it. On the other hand, I think that concern has to be put in scale. We actually have a lot of research from around the world on just how frequently this happens. How frequently does somebody report a rape that never happened? All right, and I'm very familiar with the research. I did a study myself on this fairly recently, and the bottom line is that the best research puts that number at somewhere around 2 or 3% of reports of sexual assault reports. If you want to be very sort of conservative or liberal, depending on how you put it, somewhere between 2 and 8% at most, which means that over 90% of reports of rape are not fabrications, they're not false allegations. So we need to keep that in context. We need to keep that in perspective. Now, given that it happens very infrequently, it's actually extremely difficult to do any kind of systematic research that would allow you to say, well, if somebody's fabricating, they are more likely to say this, or and so we actually have no good research on this at all on which to base that kind of a conclusion. Unfortunately, there is in some law enforcement circles and in general an idea that if you apply certain standard techniques of interrogation, you can figure out if somebody is not telling the truth. And some of those, and one of the most common techniques, of course, is if you ask somebody to recount something that happened, right, and they give you their account. And then you ask them again, but you don't ask them to again, so okay, just tell me the same thing again. This time, the second time around, you might start from somewhere in the middle and say, okay, from that point, can you tell me again what happened after that? And then you might take them back to sort of maybe a third of the way through and ask them to go backwards. So now before that, what happened? And before that, what happened? And you do a series of questions like this. And the purpose of this is that it is true, if you're dealing with non-traumatic memory, and if somebody has fabricated something, this is a pretty good way to test whether or not they have their story straight. Now, if somebody really does a good job of preparing a story, they'll get through that kind of interrogation, all right? And that's not going to tell you whether they lied or not. If somebody didn't do a very good job of preparing, that's a pretty good way to try to trip them up and to see whether they start making mistakes, basically, in their account. But now, think about this in the context of the biology that I've just been talking about. If you're asking that kind of series of questions of a trauma victim who has only intense fragments and who, under pressure, might try to remember what happened first, what happened second, what happened third, because they're trying to be nice and trying to be cooperative. And in the meantime, you're seeing this as an interrogation technique to test whether or not they're lying. You're going to draw the conclusion that they're lying because they can't answer those kinds of questions in that way. So you arrive at a false conclusion. And so I think, if we're concerned about false allegations, in my experience, in the vast majority of cases, if there's a false report, it falls apart really quickly. The key to any kind of interview or evaluation is compassion and empathy, because this is something I think everybody knows this intuitively. There's actually research on this if you want to go to the research, but I think we can all readily understand that if you want someone to give you the most and the most accurate information that they have, the sort of the most complete answers to the questions that you have for them, the most effective way of doing that is for them to feel like they can trust you. If you don't trust somebody, if you're not sure if this other person who's asking you questions is looking at you with hostility or with skepticism, with disbelief, you're just not going to answer the questions as freely. And you're not going to essentially give access to that person to the things that are sort of going on in your head, the things that you remember, the little fragments that that you partially remember. So in any interview, in any evaluation, the key is to build a really strong rapport. And the way you do that is you be open, you be compassionate, you be empathic, and people respond to that. And the result is that you get much better information, much more complete information. I think what happens sometimes is some people in law enforcement view their role as a sort of a neutral fact gatherer. And that's absolutely, I totally agree with that, 100%. That's exactly the role for law enforcement, to be a neutral fact gatherer. The question is, how do you best gather those facts? So you can be compassionate, warm, open, empathic with a rape victim, and that doesn't make you one iota less neutral. That just makes you a better fact gatherer. Some of the forensic work I do, I interview and evaluate men who have raped and murdered children, multiple children. And I do the same thing. I go in there and I am warm, compassionate, empathic. And the result of that is that they give me more information. So it's not that in order to be a neutral fact gatherer, you have to be have this demeanor of no connection, no empathy, no compassion, so forth. You have to be skeptical. You have to make sure that they understand that you're skeptical. In the kinds of questions. That doesn't serve your purpose. All right, and so I think it's the key to any kind of forensic interview, whether you're interviewing a victim or you're interviewing an offender, is to forge a bond with them, to make them trust you, to make them feel like they can talk to you. And the way you do that is that you be warm, compassionate, empathic, and you get your information. And what you do with that information then is you have more information, so you've done your job in the system. And if you're running the investigation, then you have more information with which to advance the investigation.